It had been a long day, the kind that stuck to your skin like humidity, the kind that made you want to disappear into a bed that didn't belong to anyone else. My train had been canceled. Then the next bus was delayed. I stood in line at the terminal for over an hour, surrounded by tired strangers and the kind of artificial light that bleaches everything of softness. When they finally called my route, I didn't feel relief, only the dull ache of movement for movement's sake. My body was tired, but my mind was louder than ever. I boarded the bus slowly, dragging a suitcase that had seen better years, its wheels wobbling like old bones. The driver barely looked at me. The aisle was narrow, suffocating, a tunnel of other people's elbows and smells and breath. Every seat I passed was taken, legs pressed together, bags clutched tightly, eyes avoiding contact. For a moment, I thought I'd be told to wait for the next one. Then I saw it. One empty seat. Only one. It was next to her. She sat by the window, not reading, not sleeping, just staring out as if something important lived in the passing dark. Her presence hit me before my eyes could even fully take her in. There was something in the way she occupied space, relaxed but alert, distant yet magnetic. She didn't glance at me, didn't shift or acknowledge me in any way, but somehow I felt like I was already part of her periphery. I took the seat slowly, carefully, as if the cushion itself might reject me. My coat rustled. My knee bumped the edge of her bag, but she didn't move. I tucked myself into the space as best I could and looked ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just sat down next to something other. Not dangerous, not warm, but undeniably alive and watching, even if it wasn't looking. The bus pulled away from the terminal with a lurch that rocked me sideways, pressing my shoulder briefly against hers. Her body was firm, still. I pulled away quickly, too quickly, and stared at the seat in front of me like it held instructions for how to exist in this small, charged space. I became hyper-aware of everything. The fabric of my jeans against my thighs, the thrum of the engine, the dry taste of vending machine coffee in the back of my mouth. She didn't smell like perfume. She smelled like leather and maybe something green, like pine or mint. Clean, sharp, not sweet. I tried not to breathe too deeply, but every time I inhaled, the scent reached further inside me. I told myself to close my eyes, to sleep, but I couldn't. My body was too alert, like it knew something I didn't. Like it had recognized her long before I had. The lights inside the bus dimmed as we merged onto the highway. Outside, the world blurred into a smear of gas stations and late-night diners, their neon signs buzzing into the void. Inside, the passengers began to drift into stillness, necks tilted against the windows, arms folded over chests. I sat upright, stiff, my hands in my lap like a schoolgirl who didn't belong here, and still she hadn't said a word. I wondered who she was. Not in the way we wonder about people we see on the street. This was different. I felt pulled toward her, like a thread had been tied between us in a past I couldn't remember. There was no logic to it, no reason, but I couldn't ignore it. Not with the heat of her arm inches from mine. Not with the subtle weight of her presence settling into me, like a whisper I couldn't decipher. The bus moved through the night like a secret. I became aware of her breathing, slow, steady, but deliberate, as though she was choosing every inhale. I matched it without realizing. My pulse began to slow, my thoughts scattered like dust in a sunbeam. I didn't know where we were going exactly. I had a destination, sure, but something told me the real journey had just started the moment I sat down. I didn't believe in fate. Not until that night. Not until that seat. Not until her. And she still hadn't looked at me, Not once. The hours passed slowly, not measured by time, but by the way the shadows shifted across the ceiling of the bus. The rhythmic hum of the engine became background music to the thoughts I couldn't quiet. I stared straight ahead, but my focus kept drifting to the side, to her, to the way she held herself, to the aura of detachment that felt more like a decision than a condition. She hadn't moved much, but everything about her presence was movement. The curve of her wrist as it rested against the armrest, the way her fingers occasionally twitched like they were remembering something physical, each detail pulled at me in ways I didn't know how to resist. I told myself to read, to distract myself, but the book in my lap was just a prop. I turned the pages without understanding a single word. Every few minutes, my gaze flickered to her legs, crossed neatly, the hem of her coat resting just above her knees. Her skin was smooth, lit softly by the occasional passing street lamp, each flicker carving out new details I hadn't noticed before. There was a kind of symmetry to her that didn't feel accidental, like someone had sculpted her out of purpose. And I was suddenly too aware of my own body, how it sat, how it breathed, how close it was to hers. Outside, the scenery melted into repetition. Empty parking lots, strip malls closed for the night, billboards advertising things no one really needed. The world had turned into a blur of fluorescent colors and too much darkness. Inside the bus, it was quieter now. Most passengers had drifted into the numb space of shallow sleep. I envied them. My body was tired, but my nerves felt exposed, every inch of me tuned to the possibility of something I couldn't name. At one point, the driver turned the radio on low, soft jazz crackling through ancient speakers. It wasn't comforting. It was intimate in a way that made me feel too seen. I shifted in my seat, trying to get comfortable, but there was no comfort in this part of the night, only awareness. My knee brushed hers again, barely, but the contact echoed louder than any noise I'd heard all day. She didn't move. Neither did I. There's a kind of silence that lives between strangers, a polite boundary made of nothing but expectation. But this wasn't that. This was something else. The silence between us was swollen, heavy, alive with a tension that neither of us had chosen, but both of us had accepted. I began to feel like the bus itself was disappearing, like the rows of seats, the other passengers, the driver. They were all fading away. All that was left was her and me and the strange magnetic void that was pulling us closer with every passing mile. My thoughts grew louder. I imagined scenarios that had no logic. What it would feel like if she touched me, how her skin would feel against mine, what her mouth might taste like in the dark. I hated myself for it. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I was just surprised by how easily the fantasy had taken hold, how natural it felt to imagine her lips near my ear, whispering things I wasn't ready to hear. My breath became shallower, chest tight with a heat I couldn't place. She adjusted in her seat, a small shift, but it felt seismic. Her leg brushed mine again, more deliberately this time, or maybe that was just my need turning accident into intent. I didn't move away. I didn't want to. Instead, I leaned slightly toward the window, toward her warmth, hoping she would read the gesture the way I meant it, subtle, uncertain, open. My fingers itched to do something reckless. They remained still. Eventually, she placed a small blanket over her lap. Without a word, without turning, she lifted the edge of it just enough to cover part of my leg. My breath caught, my pulse stuttered, and for a moment I thought I might cry from the intimacy of it. It was such a small act. Nothing inappropriate, nothing loud, but it was everything. A signal, a welcome, a dare. Under that shared blanket, The space between us ceased to exist. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her, the shift of her thigh pressing gently into mine, the steady thrum of her body so close to my own. I felt like I was on the edge of something, suspended above a drop I couldn't see but desperately wanted to fall into. There were no words, no glances, just this charged stillness that wrapped around us like another blanket, one only we could feel. I couldn't tell how long we stayed like that. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time had stopped making sense. My body no longer obeyed the rhythms of the bus or the ticking of the clock. It responded only to proximity, to tension, to the hum of possibility that now lived just beneath my skin. Every bump in the road sent us shifting closer. Every breath she took reminded me I wasn't alone in the gravity of this silence. When the bus finally pulled into a rest stop, most people stirred, blinking awake, stretching limbs. I stayed still. She stayed still. And as the others filed out into the harsh fluorescent lights of the station, I realized I didn't want to move. Not from this seat, not from her, not from whatever was quietly unfolding in the inches between our bodies. This wasn't just a ride home. It was something else entirely. Something unnamed. Something irreversible. The road stretched endlessly ahead, painted in streaks of yellow light and patches of shadow. The hum of the tires beneath us became the only rhythm I trusted, a metronome ticking through the silence I now shared with her. The blanket still covered us, and under it, our legs pressed together with the kind of contact that pretended to be casual. But nothing about it felt accidental. There was an awareness in the stillness, a choice in the nearness, like each inch of closeness was being negotiated through breath and silence. I was afraid to move, not because I feared rejection, but because I didn't want to break whatever this was becoming. Her thigh was warm against mine, and as the bus shifted slightly with a curve in the highway, the press of her body grew more definite. She didn't pull away, neither did I. I didn't dare look at her. My eyes stayed on the back of the seat in front of me, but my entire body was tuned to her proximity. I could feel the heat of her skin radiating through the thin fabric of my pants, an almost electric pulse that made it hard to think. My fingers rested quietly on my lap, twitching slightly, craving contact I didn't yet have the courage to initiate. The air around us thickened. The noise of the bus faded into a low, indistinct murmur. Somewhere behind us, someone coughed. A phone vibrated on a seat tray. But none of that mattered. My awareness had narrowed to a single point of focus, her presence beside me, the slow, deliberate rise and fall of her breath, and the slight brush of her elbow against mine every time the bus hit a bump. Each contact lit something inside me I didn't know I carried, something ancient, aching, and new all at once. Her hand shifted slightly on the armrest between us, and the back of her fingers grazed my skin. The contact was fleeting, so brief it might have been dismissed as an accident, but I knew better. My pulse jumped, and a flush crept up my neck. I didn't turn to see if she was watching me, but I could feel her attention in the way the air moved, in the static between us. It was as though she'd touched me with intention, just enough to mark a boundary, to see if I'd cross it. I didn't move at first. I stayed in place, letting the sensation of her touch echo through me. But then, almost without thinking, I shifted just enough so that our arms brushed again, this time more fully, skin to skin, a deliberate return. She didn't react visibly, didn't jerk away, didn't flinch. Instead, she exhaled, soft, steady, and her fingers curled slightly against the armrest. We remained like that, the side of my arm pressed to hers, heat bleeding into heat, a silent conversation written in nerves and restraint. The landscape outside had dissolved into blackness. There was nothing to see but reflections. I glanced at the window and caught the outline of our bodies in the glass. Two figures sitting too close to be strangers, too quiet to be just tired travelers. I watched her reflection more than I should have, tracing the shape of her cheekbone, the arc of her neck, the way her head tilted slightly toward me as though pulled by gravity. My breath caught again, stuck somewhere between want and fear. Her hand moved again, this time brushing against the top of my thigh. It lingered longer than it should have if it were an accident. The tips of her fingers rested there, light as air, unmoving but unbearably present. I felt my muscles tense, not in rejection but in anticipation. My eyes closed for a moment, and I let the sensation root itself inside me. That touch, gentle, wordless, spoke louder than any confession ever could. I didn't know what to do with the need building in my chest. I didn't know how to hold it without unraveling. Every brush of her skin against mine fed it, stoked it, shaped it into something more real than anything I had felt in years. My mind flickered through excuses, through rationalizations, through memories of boundaries I thought I'd never cross. But all of it crumbled in the wake of this quiet, persistent desire that wrapped itself around my ribs and refused to let go. At some point, my pinky finger shifted and touched hers. Just that, barely a whisper of contact, but it felt like shouting. My entire body stilled, waiting for her response. She didn't move away. Instead, she let her hand relax beside mine, our fingers now loosely aligned. I didn't intertwine them. I didn't dare, but the closeness was enough to ignite every nerve ending in my palm, a kind of suspended promise hanging between us. There was a charge in the air now, undeniable and growing. The kind of energy that hums before a storm, just before lightning strikes. I sat there, trembling inside, wrapped in the cocoon of this strange intimacy, knowing we were both pretending this was still innocent, knowing it wasn't, and knowing, too, that we were both waiting for something, for a signal, for the moment the balance would tip and everything quiet would become undeniable. That moment didn't come with a dramatic gesture. It came in a soft shift of her head toward mine, the way her shoulder rested slightly closer, the steady alignment of breath between us. We said nothing, did nothing more than sit, but in that quiet space, something irreversible unfolded. Not yet action, but understanding, and I knew, without question, that the distance between us had ceased to exist. We had already begun to touch, long before skin ever fully met skin. We stepped off the bus somewhere that wasn't meant to be our destination. The town was quiet, barely more than a cluster of lights hovering in the dark, a rest stop pretending to be a place. I didn't question it when she moved toward the door during a pause at the gas station. I followed her without thinking, suitcase forgotten, sense of direction irrelevant. It felt like waking from a dream, but choosing to walk deeper into it. The air outside was colder than I expected, biting through my coat, but I barely noticed. We walked without a word through the parking lot, past vending machines humming beneath a flickering light, and into a motel that looked like it had been peeled out of time. The front office smelled like cheap carpet and microwave popcorn. There was a room key in her hand before I even realized she'd spoken to the clerk. The numbers on the door blurred as we approached, my heartbeat drowning out everything else. It wasn't nerves. It was inevitability, like the pull of the tide after standing too close to the edge for too long. Inside, the room was dim and yellow, washed in the same dull glow as every cheap motel ever built. The bedspread was patterned with shapes that meant nothing. A chair sat in the corner beneath a dusty lamp, and a single long mirror hung crooked on the wall. The silence between us no longer felt like a pause. It felt like a held breath waiting to break open. She peeled off her coat first, her movement slow but without hesitation. I stood still for a moment longer, unsure if I was meant to stay closed or shed something deeper. I stepped out of my shoes and felt the worn carpet under my feet, scratchy and real. The air in the room seemed to shift as I moved closer to her, not with words, but with presence. She didn't reach for me. She didn't need to. There was a magnetism pulling us together now, fueled by the hours we had spent in close silence, by the weight of every unspoken glance and accidental touch. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the intensity of how badly I wanted to feel her skin against mine. When our bodies finally met, it wasn't delicate. It was needful, urgent, stripped of any pretense. Her mouth found mine like it had been waiting, and my fingers dug into the fabric of her shirt, pulling her closer, anchoring myself to the inevitability of the moment. She tasted like distance and something sweet, something familiar I hadn't named until now. We moved as if following choreography we didn't remember learning. My back found the edge of the bed, and I sank into it without resistance. She climbed over me, not with dominance, but with certainty, her knees on either side of my hips, her hands pushing my coat off my shoulders, her lips trailing heat along my throat. My breath stuttered as she kissed lower, undoing me with each shift of her mouth. My body opened to her without instruction, thighs parting as her fingers slid under my shirt, tracing the bare skin of my stomach with reverence that felt almost cruel in its gentleness. Every inch of me was on fire, and still I craved more. She undressed me slowly, pulling layers away like secrets. Her eyes never left mine, even as her hands found the clasp of my bra, even as her palms cupped my breasts and her mouth followed with quiet, deliberate pressure. I arched into her, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I wanted to disappear into her hands, her mouth, the rhythm of her hips as she moved littler, kissing a line down my stomach, pausing at the edge of everything. My body begged for her, not with words, but with heat, with breathless shivers, with the way my fingers tangled in her hair when she finally slipped beneath my underwear. When her tongue touched me, I forgot where we were. I forgot how we got there. My thighs trembled as her mouth moved in slow, steady strokes, each flick of her tongue pulling me closer to the edge. I couldn't stop the sound that escaped me, raw and low, and unlike anything I'd ever let out before. She held me there, steady, patient, as if she had all night, as if this moment existed outside of time. And when I came, I shattered into her mouth, into the air, into the warmth of her body holding mine. She kissed her way back up, her skin warm against my damp chest. Her breath was rough now, her body trembling slightly as she lay down beside me, pulling the blanket over us like we were something worth protecting. I turned to her without thought, pressing my face to her shoulder, wrapping my arm around her waist. She let me hold her. Her skin smelled like sweat and clean cotton, and something I already missed even as I inhaled it. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence in that motel room said everything. It told me that I had just crossed a line I could never return from, that what we did was not a mistake. But it also wasn't a promise. It was something suspended, something dangerous, something that felt like the truth and a lie wrapped into one moment of pleasure. I closed my eyes with her breath against my neck, wondering what this would mean tomorrow, wondering if I had just found something or lost something I couldn't name. Morning came without ceremony. The motel room was filled with a soft, flat light that made everything look faded, like a memory already beginning to blur. I woke up slowly, unsure at first if I had actually slept. My body was sore in places that reminded me of what had happened. My legs, my lips, my chest. The sheets were twisted around me, still holding her scent, still holding the echo of how her body moved over mine. But she was no longer in the bed. For a moment, panic pricked the back of my neck. I sat up too quickly, the thin blanket slipping off my shoulders as my eyes scanned the room. The bathroom door was open, the bed beside me cold. My heart raced as I imagined her gone, imagined this being the kind of story that ended in silence. But then I heard the sound, low and steady, water filling a cup in the sink. She emerged a moment later, fully dressed, her hair pulled back, her eyes unreadable. She didn't look at me as she moved around the room, gathering her things. Her movements were efficient, almost practiced. I watched from the bed, still naked, still wrapped in something too big to define. 1,000 words gathered on my tongue, but none of them made it to my lips. She slipped on her coat, zipped up her bag, and stood near the door for a second that felt too long. Then she stepped out, and the door closed with a soft click that sounded louder than any goodbye. I sat there, motionless, for what felt like an hour. The room was suddenly empty in a way it hadn't been before. Not just because she was gone, but because something had been taken with her, some part of me I hadn't realized I had offered. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself, feeling the weight of everything settle across my shoulders. My skin still tingled from her touch. My chest still carried the rhythm of her breath. And yet, she had left like it meant nothing. Eventually, I dressed. The clothes I had worn yesterday felt different now, stretched in places, scented by sex and cheap detergent. I washed my face in the motel sink, stared at myself in the mirror, and didn't recognize the expression I saw. I looked older, or maybe just more exposed, as if some layer had been peeled back in the night, and what was left was raw and unsheltered. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but all I felt was a slow, creeping numbness that made every movement feel heavier than it should have. Outside, the sky was gray and uncommitted. I walked back to the bus station with quiet steps, unsure if I was retracing my path or escaping it. The streets were damp from a rain I hadn't noticed. The air smelled like gasoline and dust. People passed me without a second glance, their lives moving forward while mine felt suspended in a place that didn't exist on any map. I bought a new ticket. I didn't look at the destination. It didn't matter anymore. The bus was nearly empty. I chose a seat near the back and pressed my forehead to the window. The glass was cool, grounding. I watched the buildings slide past as the vehicle pulled away, watched the motel disappear behind a row of tired trees. Part of me expected to see her standing there, waiting, realizing something had been left unsaid. But there was nothing, no silhouette, no sudden return, just the fading outlines of a night that had already begun to dissolve. As the miles passed, I replayed it all in fragments. The curve of her back in the dim light, the way her fingers had gripped my hips, the sound she made when I kissed her neck. I didn't know what any of it meant. I didn't know if she thought of me as a stranger or something more. Maybe I had been a detour, a momentary escape. Maybe I had let myself become a place to land without asking if she'd stay. The ache wasn't just physical. It had taken root somewhere deeper, somewhere I hadn't known was still tender. I wondered what I would do if I saw her again, if I'd reach for her, or if I'd pretend we had never met. I didn't even know her name, and yet I felt like she had written something permanent into me with her hands, her mouth, her silence. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. Around me, the bus hummed and rocked and moved towards something. I didn't know if I was going home or simply away, but I knew I wouldn't return the same, because some exits aren't marked with signs. Some take you through places you can't explain, and some don't lead back at all. It happened weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, under the bland hum of grocery store lighting. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering the aisles, letting the routine of errands fill the emptiness I hadn't acknowledged since the motel. I moved slowly, pushing the cart as if it weighed more than it did, pretending I was whole. My body moved out of habit, but my mind had stayed in that motel room, in that silence, in her hands. I told myself I had let it go. I lied convincingly. I turned the corner into the produce section and froze. There she was. Same curve of the neck, same swing of hair, same posture that looked like it belonged to someone who didn't need anyone. She was standing in front of the apples, reading a label like the world hadn't ended inside my body the night she left. For a split second, I thought it was a trick of light, a hallucination conjured by my hunger for closure. But then she turned her head, and her profile hit me like a blow to the chest. There was no recognition in her face, not even a flicker. Her eyes passed over me as if I were just another person reaching for bananas. She didn't flinch, she didn't smile. It was the exact kind of glance you give a stranger when you're thinking about dinner and deadlines and weekend plans. I stood there, stomach dropping, mouth dry, trying to find even a sliver of familiarity in her gaze. But it wasn't there. It had never been there. And then I saw them. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, tugging at the sleeve of her coat. She reached down, ruffled his hair, smiled with ease, and placed a hand on his back. A second later, a woman appeared, taller, older, with calm eyes and a presence that screamed permanence. She leaned in, kissed her temple, whispered something close, and the woman, the one who had pressed her mouth between my thighs and made me lose myself, smiled back and laughed. It hit me with sickening clarity. I wasn't a chapter in her life. I was a page torn from the spine and discarded. Whatever it had been for me, for her, it had been something else, something brief, something disposable. I had built a shrine out of silence, and she had already cleaned the altar and replaced it with family photos. I watched them walk away, her hand in her partner's, her son skipping ahead, and I stood in front of the citrus like someone who had forgotten how to move. The moment felt sticky, absurd. My body buzzed with humiliation, my skin hot, my throat tight. I left the cart where it was, halfway between lemons and limes, and walked out into the parking lot without looking back. The sunlight was sharp, cutting through the illusion I had nursed for too long. I climbed into my car, slammed the door, and let the silence bloom around me again. Only this time, it wasn't heavy with mystery. It was hollow. I sat there for a long time, watching people come and go, faces blurred by the windshield, living lives I'd never understand. The memory of her mouth, her fingers, the way she had pulled me close and held me like I was something fragile. It all felt fake now, like a fever dream stitched together by loneliness. And still, some part of me missed her. Not the real her, but the her I had invented in the weeks that followed. The version that might have stayed. The version that never existed. I drove home with the windows down, letting the air burn my cheeks raw. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, but inside, something curdled. Not grief, not regret, something smaller, meaner, like biting into a cherry you thought was sweet and tasting only vinegar. And I chewed it slowly, deliberately, letting the bitterness fill my mouth until there was nothing else left to taste.